that you do a little bit of both. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Yasmin Bolden. As I said before, I'm a first year undergraduate planning on majoring in writing seminars and medicine, science, and the humanities here at Hopkins. And I share that poem with you today because the wonderful person who I'm about to introduce you to, whose name itself is poetry, is all about beloved community and destroying the structures which keep us from community and from truly knowing one another and ourselves. We are so blessed today to be joined by the poet Crystal Valentine, who has been hailed by the New York Daily News as a winning wordsmith. A nationally and internationally acclaimed poet, activist, and educator, Valentine earned her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and Master of Fine Arts in Poetry at New York University, where she was a Goldwater Fellow. Now she is the author of Not Everything is a Eulogy and a generator and fierce protector of Black joy, strongly believing that intersectionality is a key factor in liberation. As a queer Black woman, a lot of her work revolves around bridging the ever-present gap between her identities. Her poems are gorgeous, sweeping, shielding wings that act as sanctuaries accessible to all Black people, queer, trans, women, gender nonconforming, poor, loud, angry, ghetto. She believes that when all of these voices are present and accounted for, we can really begin the gruesome work of understanding and breaking down the systematic oppression. When she is not performing, the former New York City Youth Poet Laureate can be found leading youth workshops at Harlem Children's Zones and Urban Word, New York City. Ultimately, she aims to make her poetry a sanctuary for all identities of the African diaspora. She uses her platform to spread joy and self-love by advocating for her community and documenting and humanizing their lived experiences as people of color in America. Born and raised in the Bronx, Crystal Valentine now lives in Boston, Massachusetts. She has traveled across seas performing on platforms in Paris, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, and elsewhere. She is the winner of the 2015 and 2013 College Union's Poetry Slam Invitational, the second place winner of the National Poetry Slam, and the 9th ranked poet by way of the Women of the World Poetry Slam and the Individual World Poetry Slam. Among her many honors, she was named Glamour Magazine's 2016 College Woman of the Year, Teen Vogue's Rising Young Black Thought Leader, and was the recipient of the National Conference of College Women Student Leaders Women's Distinction Award and a Callaloo Fellow. Crystal's work has been featured on MSNBC, Blavity Button Poetry, The Huffington Post, BET, CNN, the New York Daily News, and more. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Crystal Valentine.
Wow, that was a beautiful, beautiful introduction, Yasmin. Thank you so much. First off, I want to say that I see you all, everyone there in person at Johns Hopkins University. I see you all, and I wish that I was there with you. Thank you so, so, so much for coming. So before I get too ahead of myself, I do want to do some thank yous. Thank you, Johns Hopkins University's Office of Multicultural Affairs. Thank you to Diversity and Inclusion. Thank you, Yasmin, for that lovely introduction again. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Yudi, who is going to be our moderator later on. And thank you, everyone, every single person that played a role in the effort to make me come here and allow me to be in this space with you all. I would also like to thank you, audience, for showing up. We are living through devastating times, which even as I say it is interesting because I always feel as though we've been living through devastating times, and yet we still somehow show up for each other and for ourselves and for the perseverance of our heritage. So I truly thank you from the bottom of my heart for your presence. And lastly, because I am who I am, I have to give a special shout out to my Black folk, both alive and no longer living on this physical plane with us. And with that being said, I'll talk a little bit about what this speech or keynote is going to be about. So I entitled it Blackness and the Volta, the perpetual pivot towards liberation. So I'm going to be kind of using some poetry terms that I've learned along the way. I'm going to be applying it towards Blackness. One thing that I want you to know is that the top half of this talk will be more kind of lecture based, and then the bottom half will be the real good stuff, the poetry. And then some in between, I'll do some poems as well. The other thing that I want you to know is that I am a Black queer woman, proudly so. And I don't know, this pandemic has been interesting. It's giving me a lot of time to kind of dive deeper into myself, into my heritage. And as I dive deeper, specifically into my Blackness, I also dive into my spirituality. And specifically, I am talking about my relationship with my ancestors. One of my more recent ancestors is the Immaculate Mother, poet, and change maker, Lucille Clifton. Miss Lucille is known as a poet who says a lot with few words. She is precise in her language, a language that always points towards its root in the ever evolving Black experience, specifically the Black woman experience. Her work is quoted all the time, sometimes in poetry craft talks, other times as Instagram and Twitter captions, and in some occasions, I'll even see it tattooed beautifully on someone else's skin. Ms. Clifton has now since passed, and her words, amongst other tributes, is the legacy that she has left behind. When people share her work, what they're really doing is sharing a symbol of Black resilience and Black self-love. So before I go any further, I would like to begin with one of her more well-known poems, which is entitled, "Won't You Celebrate With Me?" It goes as followed. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up. Here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my hand holding tight my other hand, come celebrate with me. That every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Now, I know that I am virtual here with you all, but I'm trying to kind of make this a physical space, an intimate space that kind of transcends physicality. So I'm curious for the people who are here, and I can't see you. Are people familiar with this poem? Can I get a show of hands? Is anyone familiar with this poem? Okay, yeah, Yasmin, you're familiar, nice. There are many reasons why I wanted to begin this talk with this particular poem by this particular poet. And one of those reasons is that Miss Lucille Clifton was born on June 27th, 1936 in Dupuis, New York, and she died on February 13th, 2010 in Baltimore. Wherever I go, I always try to bring my people with me, but it seems that in addition to the lovely folk here at Johns Hopkins University, perhaps Miss Lucille in spirit has brought me here to commune with you all. And isn't that one of the core foundation of Blackness, community? So the other reason why I wanted to start with this poem is because I wanted to talk to you all about the Volta and how the Volta pertains to Blackness. The poem that I just read, "Won't You Celebrate With Me," is written in the form of a sonnet. And for those of you who might not know, a sonnet is considered to be a classical form of poetry that traditionally is written in 14 lines, and it has a very fancy rubric that dictates the iambic pentameter and also specific rhyme schemes. Additionally, the sonnet has a volta that normally appears somewhere towards the end of the poem. And like many things adopted and gatekept by whiteness, for a very long time, the sonnet was not a form that academic, read white, poets thought Black folk, Black writers capable of comprehending, much less executing in their own work. And so it is significant for me that Miss Lucille Clifton chose this form as a means to express her personal resilience, because the gag is she knew what it meant to take up space in a place that, due to her status as non-Black and woman, she was unwanted. And sometimes when I consider these factors, I truly just have to laugh to myself, because isn't this the epitome of irony? Isn't this the slap in the face? Isn't this the ultimate shade to everything that has tried to kill her and failed? And this is where the Volta comes in. The Volta is the unexpected turn that appears in the last line of the poem. It is that moment where the speaker or the logic shifts. It's that moment where there's a revelation, where there is change. And in Miss Clifton's poem, that turn, that revelation is the failure of death, specifically the failure of death in the face of a Black woman who has chosen deliberately to carve out her own space. As a poet, it is my belief that poetry, like all art, is life reenacted through a different medium. Therefore, if art is life, then the Volta is not simply a literary device, it is also a human device that we use and witness in everyday life. I would even go as far as to argue that the Volta can help translate what it means to be a Black person living specifically in America and around the world. Because how many times have we Black folk have had to shift our predetermined trajectory as a means of survival to evade death? And when I say death, I am talking about death in the literal, tangible sense, as well as the small deaths that we must navigate in this systemic killing machine that is America. And alternatively, how many times have us Black folk have had to shift our uncontrolled trajectory away from death and towards hope, towards joy, towards love and life? When I use the word Volta, I am emphasizing a turning point. And through that turning point, what I'm addressing is the notion of pivoting. So let's go to Google for a second. As defined by Google, the word pivot has many definitions, and I would like to share some of them with you all now. Its noun, or one of its noun definitions, is to be defined as a person or thing that plays a central part in an activity or organization. And yet another definition is the verb form, which means to depend on. I think the cool thing about language is that we have these singular words with many different definitions layered atop one another. And these definitions work both individually and simultaneously at different points in time, depending on the context in which it is used. So with all these definitions, I'm sure that you might have already foreshadowed that I'm going to be using the word pivot a lot in this talk. And I do want to first note that when I say talk, I really do mean a discussion. I really mean a conversation. I mean that it's happening between me and you folks who are here virtually, and you folks who are physically in Johns Hopkins University. Because you brought me here, and I'm so grateful for that. And I also recognize that I'm a guest. This is not inherently my space. This is your space. And with that in mind, I think that it's only right for you all, if you wish to, also get a chance to speak. So if you would humor me, I would like to pose a question that hopefully someone might feel enticed to answer during the Q&A portion of tonight's event. I'm really big on, again, conversation. That's how we build community. So my question is, in looking towards the future, because remember, Black History Month is named as such, but it's also, or February is also Black Future Month, right? Let's not forget that. We're always looking towards moving forward. So in looking towards the future, what will our future look like if we are not forced to constantly pivot? So if you would humor me, just think about that for a little bit, and I'll continue. As Black Americans, one of our biggest, most devastating, most dehumanizing pivots in history is what has happened during and after the Middle Passage, which resulted in the genocidal and capitalistic act of profiting off of Black physical, emotional, and mental labor. And what I mean by this is the Middle Passage was an unnatural occurrence. I'll say that again. The killing and enslavement of our people was unnatural. And before the phenomenon that was the Middle Passage, our ancestors had their own self-determined trajectory. However, due to this phenomenon, that self-determined trajectory was disrupted, almost like a rip in time and space that made up our ancestors' liberated human condition. And after this unfathomable point in history, we have had to pivot. We've had to turn towards life in unimaginable ways. So I'm going to go ahead and pivot a little bit. The Color Museum is a satirical play written by George C. Wolfe that addresses the myths, stereotypes, and realities of Black people. The play is split up into 11 exhibitions or sketches, one of which is named The Gospel According to Miss Raj. And in it, Miss Raj says, God created Black people and Black people created style. And God damn it, is that if that's not true, right? From music to art to fashion to film, all the way down to our vernacular, we have influenced the culture of America, America who has used us and exiled us. And we've influenced this culture so much so that Black culture is American culture, though many people refuse to acknowledge it as such. And I'll give you an example. I am a TikTok fan. I'll say I'm a reluctant TikTok fan. But TikTok, which I'm sure you are all familiar with, gained a huge amount of popularity during the height of the pandemic due to the lockdown and people confined to their own living quarters with unusually large quantities of time on their hands. So I'm going to interject real quick to also acknowledge that the pandemic was and still is a detriment to the entire world. We have lost and continue to lose so many precious lives, both due to the effects of the virus, as well as our government's incompetence, as well as society's inability to see how their actions and personal health decisions affects anyone they come in contact with. The pandemic also disproportionately affects Black and Brown folk, people with pre-existing health conditions, disabled folk, and essential workers. Now, for those of us who had the privilege of quarantining in our homes, while we waited for this unprecedented storm to pass, TikTok became an informational hub, an outlet for humor and human connection, especially for those of us who were bored in the house and were in the house bored. TikTok relies on the act of replication, meaning that one person, the originator, makes up a dance or a funny sound or some other kind of trend, and then hundreds and sometimes thousands of people make their own renditions. Now, this is all fun and games until the primary source of that replication is Black culture. And its primary replicators are non-Black folk who somehow always receive the credit. This, of course, is the textbook definition of appropriation. But TikTok, a social media app that has built its foundation off of the blurred lines between appropriation and appreciation, always gets a pass somehow. And I'll give you an example. This can be seen through the renegade dance. If I was less self-conscious, I might do it for you all, but I am not. So I'm going to have you, jog your memory. But the Renegade dance was created by a Black TikToker, Jalea Herman. But white TikTokers such as Charlie D'Amelio and Addison Rae have used this dance to catapult their careers into fame and millionaire status. This, of course, is nothing new, so much so that folks have developed a term for it, culture vulture, which is defined as a person or an entity that takes from cultures that are not their own without giving respect or attribution to the origin with the hopes of receiving monetary and status profit. So a couple of years ago, I wrote a poem addressing this notion of the culture vulture. And in it, I use a lot of satire and I throw a lot of shade. Yasmin, I hope maybe you like this one. I would like to share this poem with you all now. So it comes with a little preface. This is directly in response to Kylie and Kendall Jenner, who superimposed their faces onto a Biggie and Tupac t-shirt without the legacy's consent. So I'm gonna hop into the poem now. This is called White Girl Shine. Praise the mayonnaise, for it will always keep our sandwiches moisturized. For without such delicacy, Auntie would have no potato salad to bring to the cookout. Praise the white woman, for without you, Starbucks, Ugg boots, and Taylor Swift would go out of style. For without you, feminism would not know who to marginalize. For without you, America would run dry, deprived of white women tears. For without you, Raven Simone would not know who she wants to be when she grows up. For without you, Rachel Dolezal would not know who she does not want to be when she grows up. For without you, basic bitches would just be bitches. Praise the thieves. For without such villains, how would I know imitation is the highest form of flattery? For without such villains, boxer braids would just be cornrows. Mini buns would just be bantu knots. Boho ethnic tribal print dresses would just be dashikis. Praise the curious white woman. For without you, who would I have to touch my hair? Who would I have to pet me at the supermarket? Who would I have to side eye all the way to God's heavenly gates? Praise white women, for without such beings, Emmett Till would have lived to be a mother, a lover, or a father, or alive. For without you, Black men wouldn't be afraid to whistle in public. Black women wouldn't have to clutch our brothers the way I clutch your purses. For nothing negates a Black man's legacy like a white woman's lie. Praise the well-meaning white liberal. She who tries hard. She who will protest racism at the rally, but vote for Trump in the booth. She who is an ally until the bullets start flying, until the Pepsi commercial ends, until she is forced to use my body as a shield. Praise the white woman filled with rage at the sight of my self-love, who calls me scary, who calls me monster, who wishes me dead at the poetry reading, but don't even have enough money to purchase my bullet. Praise the penniless spirits, praise their bad omens, for the clouds cast upon my body only makes my shade stronger, only makes me blacker, only breathes more life into my spells, only makes it easier for me to stomp on this white girl ignorant and make you watch this Black witch rise. I always get a lot of backlash when I do this poem, especially when I do it in academic spaces. But be clear, this poem and just my entire identity is for the culture first and foremost. Because in a sense, to be Black is to be an object of profit. No matter how many times you pivot, whiteness and capitalism and colonization follows you. And isn't that, in a sense, the definition of the word pivot? So let's recall those definitions that I listed out earlier. Pivot, noun, meaning of the central point, pin or shaft in which a mechanism turns or oscillates. And doesn't whiteness and white supremacy oscillate Black folk like a vulture circling the sky, looking for its next meal? Pivot, also a noun, a person or thing that plays a central part in an activity or organization. Black folk have been playing such a pivotal role in the systemic organism that is America, that we essentially built it. That is, we became its thirsted after culture. Pivot, verb, meaning to depend on. Black folk are so dependable or so dependent on that when Black TikTokers started their own protest and stopped producing content, for the moment, TikTok dance trends ceased to exist. Black people are so dependent on that when Beyonce says stop, the world pauses for just a second. In our pivoting for survival, for acknowledgement and love and liberation, we have somehow also kept the machine of America alive. Black folk, we are the ultimate voter, the ultimate turning point. And how do we ensure, and this is the question, how do we ensure that this notion of pivoting is actually to benefit us and is actually to secure our liberation? So if I'm being honest, I am still trying to figure out an answer to that question. I began my work as a poet at the age of 13 when I entered my first year of high school. And unfortunately, at the time, I had no style and I barely had any confidence. But poetry has helped me find myself, specifically my Black queer woman self. And now my job as a poet is to write poems that pivot into history and into the future, so that my kin can find themselves. So I want to do another poem, and we have reached the part of the talk where I just kind of go ham on poems, which I'm really excited about. And I believe I have about 9 minutes left, so I got some time with you all. In the notion of pivoting, I'm still trying to understand my identity as both Black and American. So I'll give you an example. My grandparents and my parents, they are proud to be American, and that's because they fought for it. They marched for it. They watched their friends and family members be beaten for it. And I'm of a different generation. I want to do a poem called Black Girl Bathed in the Blood of the Free. And I wrote this poem when I was in Paris. So that's the main context that I want for you to have. He says he can tell I'm from the Bronx and I smile because I am a foreigner in this country. And that is what you do when you are in a place you don't belong. I didn't know I was American until I came to Paris. Here, they don't care that I'm Black, but their eyes still linger on me a bit longer. He says, Mike Tyson is from the Bronx, and I smile. He says he's Russian, and I want to cock my neck and say, my country fought your country in a war and stole your name. And now you can't even remember the taste of your motherland's breast milk. It is a childish thing to do, I know. A dangerous thing to say to a man who can spit in my face and call me a bad word. Or maybe that's just a foreigner thing. See, I'm so American. I can walk into another person's home and act like I built it. When I'm thinking about the notion of pivoting, specifically, or one of the notions I'm also thinking about is my choice to pivot into anger. Because I feel that as Black folk, we are often demonized for our anger. And in the words of James Baldwin, to be Black in America is to be in a constant state of rage. But let's talk about where that rage comes from. The truth is, I'm sad. I'm sad that when I look back on my history, I see laughs for sure. I see smiles, I see good moments, but then I also see my ancestors drenched in blood. And that sadness pivots as well. That sadness becomes rage. That sadness becomes irony. That sadness becomes a way for me to feel something. And for me to make other people feel what I'm feeling as well. So to kind of close out, I would like to give you all a little story. And this is also kind of talking about my pivot into language. By finding my poetry, by finding my voice, I also found essentially my role in what I believe is the revolution, is the liberation. I believe everyone has a role. Sometimes there are people on the front lines. Sometimes we have our healers. I would like to think I can provide you with the words that is honest and uplifting. So let's talk to you about how I established my language, because it was not easy. When I was born and when I was growing up and learning how to speak, I had a very, very bad lisp. The lisp was so bad that I would have to be taken out of class to receive special attention so that I would be able to speak right. And if we're thinking about Black folk and speech, we're always being told we do not speak right, whether it is because of a lisp or whether it is because of African American vernacular. But I digress. So let's fast forward. I eventually got rid of my lisp. And when I say get rid of my lisp, I mean I beat my tongue into submission. So in 2017, I was invited to go to South Africa for their Poetry Africa festival. And while I was there, I met a lot of amazing poets, amazing activists and change makers. And some of my friends out there tried to teach me Zulu. Now, I'm not sure if there are folks in here, in this virtual plane or physical plane at Johns Hopkins that are from South Africa, but like many African countries, they have a lot of languages and dialects. So Zulu is just kind of one of those languages. And to my American ear, right, to my American trained ear, when I heard my friends speaking Zulu, it sounded a lot like they were lisping their words. And I remember telling them that, dang, if I didn't have to go through all of that terrible speech torture, I would be able to speak this language better. So here is a sense of my ultimate pivot. Here's my belief. My lisp is intentional because before people came to where my ancestors' original birthplace was, before my ancestors were stolen, they had their own culture, their own language, their own way of life. And my lisp is my mouth's attempt at fighting off colonization, because I am a big believer that the body never forgets, no matter when it is birthed. So I'll go ahead and I'll end with this poem. It's called Mother Tongue, and it's also dedicated to my mother. Little known fact, during the antebellum era, runaway slaves were most commonly described in two ways. First, by their appearance, their clothing or lack thereof, their weight and body size. Second, by their mouths, teeth, missing tongues, or in most cases, stutters. Little known fact, speech impediments can be caused by psychological trauma. Every person in my family carries a speech impediment like an heirloom. My mother is best known for her mouth, her swollen tongue, her teeth, or lack thereof, that was knocked out, then replaced after her first marriage. I am best known for my lisp. There are certain words I do not know how to say. I practice speaking in the mirror, familiarize myself with a language that draws blood to my gums. If I speak for too long, my mouth rusts. My mother took me to speech class because my teachers called me stupid, called me learning disability, called me case study therapist, called me lazy tongue, said I speak with vowels chained by the limbs. I say, what has your degrees taught you about chains? I say, trauma never leaves the same way it enters. It anchors itself to the bone. Every tooth becomes an ancestor's skull. Their pain has settled in my blood, and I do not know how to release it. No matter how many dead bodies ago the suffering occurred, I do not know exactly why I started to lisp, but once I was made to pledge allegiance to a murderous flag, and my tongue has been limping ever since. I do not know why my vowels blister against their own heat, but once my tongue was held down and I was still commanded to speak. Little known fact, when you place a fist in the mouth, the tongue instinctively wraps around the knuckle. Water rushes in through the sides, slushes the letter S. Even save can sound like slave. Even a voice can drown. I do not have a lazy tongue. I have a tongue paralyzed from constant warfare. If they keep saying the same thing, then it loses its meaning. That's why my tongue makes me repeat my trauma differently every single time. They say, how am I American if I can't speak the language? I say I'm bilingual. Once death enters the mouth, every word spoken becomes a eulogy. Every name I call upon prepares for its funeral. I do not know if they are angry with me for butchering their language or resentful. I've managed to build a house out of a casket, and they can't play landlord. Little known fact, Emmett Till had a stutter. Sometimes When he stuttered too hard, he whistled. Sometimes I slur so hard, I hiss when they come for me. They will say I spoke in twisted tongues, the language of the damned, the language of the whip and scar, the living and the dead. They will say I spoke as if my tongue was a swaying body. I will say my tongue is a swaying body. And I get it from my mother. Thank you so much, so much, so much. Thank you for having me.
On behalf of Hawkins community, I would love to thank you so much for being here and sharing with us, giving this talk. Incredible poems. I know that I have some more identities that overlap with your own, and everything you said really resonated with me. I'm tearing up a little bit. Just very incredible work that you've been able to share with us. I'm so glad I was able to be a part of it. We do have an audience over on Zoom and also in person. So I'd like to introduce myself first. So my name is Yudi. I'm a junior here at Hopkins. I'm the director of Voices of Color, which creates a space for women of color to, women and non-binary individuals of color to come together and have conversations. And so at this point of the event, I would like to open it up to anyone who has a question that they would like to give to you. They can put it in the chat if they would like to. Or we encourage also people to use the raise hand feature on Zoom in order to be able to be given permission to say their question out loud. So I'll give a little bit of time. I see Yasmin has her hand raised here, so I believe that she can unmute and ask her question.
Sure. So my first question that I had is, as a Black poet who writes about current events in the state of Black people, how do you personally continue to do the work you do while also protecting your heart? Because I know a lot of Black people have wrestled with this. I know a lot of Black poets have wrestled with this, specifically if they are queer, disabled, or otherwise marginalized as well.
That's actually a really great question. So the truth of the matter is, I actually kind of changed the topics that I kind of focus on. So right now I'm actually working on my second full-length manuscript, and it's more so kind of focused on my mother. So specifically, right, the experience of being a Black mother. I'm not trying to do that weird thing that does not acknowledge intersectionality, right? But I think also, if I'm being truthful, I take a break. So before I loved poetry, I loved anime. So like that was my first introduction to any kind of like a creative thing. I remember when I was about like, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years old, watching Adult Swim late at night. So when I get kind of too bogged down by like reality, I like to pivot, keyword, into fantasy. And I do that also by like reading young adult novels, writing young adult novels and stuff like that.
Thank you for that.
There's a question coming in through the chat, so I'll read that shortly. I guess in the meantime, what's your favorite anime?
Oh, right now is hands down Attack on Titan. I have theories about Attack on Titan. I mean, obviously it's like referencing like the Holocaust, but I would be as bold as to say Attack on Titan is one of the best anime ever. I would be as bold as to say that. And I never really do.
Okay, so the question has now appeared. I'll read it. What are your thoughts on how the Black Lives Matter movement became popular in 2020?
Wow, I have a lot of conflicting thoughts because I think, unfortunately, so I'm always on Twitter. And what I've seen on Twitter is that there were kind of a lot of criticism towards the Black Lives Matter movement, just in terms of like making tangible change. And I think that, I don't know, they've come, but that also makes you think about kind of like, we have these people that we put into the spotlight, and then they stay in the spotlight until we turn against them a little bit. And I feel like a little bit of that has happened, obviously not to kind of relieve them of any of their own accountability, but I think that it was also in part amazing, right? Because devastating times, like we were in the middle of a pandemic, like the height of the pandemic, and we still were kind of out on the streets marching. I remember that I was both in New York and in Boston, kind of marching for Breonna Taylor, for George Floyd. I mean, I can honestly list so many people, right? And it felt like there was a certain kind of energy, though, that was kind of present. And sometimes I feel like it's hard to like sustain like that energy, to sustain that momentum, because also Black and brown folk are the ones who are being like mainly targeted by the coronavirus, right? Due to like housing situations, due to the economic status that America and colonization has put us in, right? So on one hand, I'm thinking 2020 was a great kind of show out for just people marching for Black life. And on the other hand, I think that we were also in like almost a frantic, devastating time, because we were at the height of the pandemic, and marching outside meant a different kind of vulnerability, right? Thinking about folks who, you know, are immune compromised and stuff like that, right? Folks who kind of had to play a different role in terms of like showing up for the community. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for that question.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I noticed that in a lot of your responses to everything, you give a lot of nuance and you choose your words very carefully. So I really appreciate just everything that you're doing. I'll give a little bit of time for another question. But I guess in the meantime, I would like to bring up a question that I had when I was listening to the talk. It's you talked about like you could have touched on the tone policing that a lot of Black people who face oftentimes where we're seen as very angry. But I feel like it's we have reason to be angry, right? And in my creative work, I often turn to comedy as like an outlet for my anger in a way. And I noticed that in one of your poems, you had a little bit of satire and comedy there. And I was kind of wondering, how do you choose when to use the different outlets for how you feel about certain topics?
So there was a point in my life where, okay, I learned it all from my family. I come from a family of jokesters, and they would always be on me. You know, I feel like Black people can make a joke out of anything, and my family was not exempt from that. So I truly get it from them. You know, like the dozens, right? Like being able to go tit for tat. I'm also like an admirer of that. The thing about my poems, the reason why I really first started writing poems was because I was a really kind of vulnerable young person that was often kind of othered, even within my own community, that I was often bullied, that I was often kind of cast aside. And my poems was my attempt at the dozens. I could never think of like a witty thing or a clever thing to say to a bully who tried to make fun of me for whatever reason. But I would have that moment when I'm on the train station going back home, and I'm like, oh, I should have said, that's why your mama, X, Y, and Z. And what it resulted in was just kind of me writing a bunch of these poems. And the scope just got wider and wider. So, in a sense, I'm like writing towards this bully, and then I'm writing towards like the Jenners and Kardashians, and then I'm writing towards Trump, who is who tried to get me banned. So it just kind of got broader and broader. And sometimes you just gotta, I think I just have to approach racism like that. I have to approach it like, as bare minimum, this big bully that I gotta take down. And if I can't take it down physically, I gotta use the dozens and I gotta use my words to take it down.
Yeah, thank you for that response. Yeah, I really understand where you're coming from there. It makes a lot of sense. It gives a good insight into your process. It appears that another question has come into the chat, so I'll read it out loud. It says, how long does it take you to write a poem, and what is your process like?
Okay. So the thing about, I'll speak for myself, but I'm always in all these different like poetry classes. I did my MFA in poetry as well. A lot of my writing includes procrastination. It truly does. A lot of it includes kind of taking walks around my neighborhood, or I'm such a fan of pop culture, and pop culture heavily influences my poetry. So I need to be on Twitter, I need to be on Instagram and TikTok, and I need to kind of see what's going on. And I will say that lately it has been taking me longer to write poems because I have become even more intentional and specific with my word choices. So for example, White Girl Shine, the poem that I read, that took about a month to write. Whereas the last poem I ended out with took 3 years to write, because I didn't have the life experience. I always wanted to write a poem about my lisp, about how I essentially beat down my tongue and to conform. And it didn't kind of take shape until like the 3rd year when I learned about Emmett Till and the reason why he had to whistle. And I was like, wow, Emmett Till was kind of similar to me. He also had a speech impediment. And that's when the poem finally took off.
Thank you for that. That was really, really insightful. I think at this time now, I'd like to hand it over to Yasmin to just give her acknowledgements to you and thank you again. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Crystal Valentine, for joining us tonight. All of your poems, as expected, were gorgeous, were so heartfelt, very vulnerable. Your imagery was piercing as always. Again, as a huge fan of yours, it's just amazing to have had the honor to introduce you. And again, we are so blessed to have had you here at Hopkins, speaking about Blackness as a Volta. That's going to stick in my mind for a very long time. So thank you. And now I'll turn it over to our hosts for announcements.
All right, can everyone hear me? Okay, awesome. So I will be doing the closing for today. Thank you again, Crystal, for being here and for sharing your poems with us, for sharing your words, your experience, and your perspective. It was just very touching for me to listen to it. And I'm just so happy that we got to listen with you, to be here with you. And thank you all for coming and being here today. Thank you to everyone here who's joining us online as well as on YouTube. We are so happy that we're able to celebrate Black heritage with you and that we can continue celebrating throughout the year. So with that being said, I do want to make a couple of last announcements. So the next few events that we have coming up with the Multicultural Affairs Office. So the first is going to be on March 8th. So this is for International Women's Day. So we will be having an event called Breaking the Biases, and this is with Arau Amory. So please make sure you RSVP on Hopkins groups. We'll be having that event. Next up, we'll be having the Latinx Heritage Celebration. So this will be on March 10th. This will be with Dr. Hernandez and with Sophia and Madeline Ceteo, who's here in the back. So please join us for that. So those are our March events, and we hope to see you there. Please tell your friends and your peers. Thank you all again, and have a